So first of all, I just want to say, for those I haven't met yet, I'm Elana Stein, the Director of Faculty and Scholar Residence for Hartman, North America. And I just have to say that the buzz in this place today was absolutely incredible. And I want to just take the opportunity to thank all of our speakers. I mean, it was just remarkable. Thank you. So what Rabbi Gordon Tucker and I are going to try to do in this short hour is to start bringing home some of the conversations that we talked about today in our different shiurim and our different classes, and bring it into sort of the lived experience of the Yamim Norim of the high holiday season. So Rabbi Tucker is going to start first. We're each going to give about 15 minutes, sort of reflections, perspectives, both taking from what we heard today and also our own ideas of what we think about individual and community. And then we're going to open it to the crowd to have a conversation for the last half an hour of this. Rabbi Tucker needs no introduction for most people. Nonetheless, I will say that as a storied scholar, rabbi scholar in the conservative movement for many decades, it's rather wild for us as an institution that Rabbi Tucker wants to spend his time here getting to do research with our fellows and getting to mentor some of our fellows. And what was it that you said once, like the first week you were here, I think you said something like, it feels like they all might be smarter than I am, but know they have something to learn from me.
Yeah.
I thought that was more telling about Gordon than it was about anybody else. So, please.
Okay, thank you. I second everything about the whole ambiance today. It's been wonderful. We should get going. Since I was a congregational rabbi for 24 years, as you can imagine, the whole business of the communal versus the individual, has a special resonance. You live this out every year, trying to figure out where your own individuality comes in, how it doesn't get lost in the communal. But so I can't help but bring this back down to the lived experience. But this is, after all, the Hartman Institute, so we're going to have a few texts because that's what we do here. So let me start with this one from Tractate Brachot. It's in 58a. Those who want to look it up.
No, there's
no hand. Our masters taught, if one sees massive numbers of the people Israel, this is Uchlosei Yisrael, one says, Baruch Chacham Harazim, blessed is the one who knows all secrets, for none of their thoughts are the same, nor are their physical appearances identical. Now, I tell you, I have had the impetus to say that bracha every Leil Yom Kippur. Just looking out at the masses who congregate in the synagogue on that night, as indeed on Rosh Hashanah as well, but particularly on that night. And I don't have to tell you, as a rabbi, you're thinking about actually all the secrets that you know that are entrusted to you. And it's the masses and the individuals, I mean, it's just all comes together there. But I'm telling you this because of what I consider to be a noteworthy reversal that perhaps unnoticed in a way is taking place in the history of our people. So let me give you another text. This one is from Tractate Psachim in 64b. Our masters taught, never was a person trampled in the temple courtyard at the time of the Pesach offering, except for 1 year in the time of Hillel, when it happened, Nebuch isn't in the Talmud, that it happened to one elderly man, and that became known as the Pesach of trampling. Now, you see, at least since the time of King Josiah in the 7th century BCE, Pesach was the great national holiday. That's when you renewed your membership in the Jewish people by participating in that rite. I think that is really the true meaning of the threat of karet, of being cut off for those who neglect the Passover rite. They failed to renew their membership. They're cut off. And then the text goes on, says, once King Agrippa wished to ascertain the extent of the Jewish population, so he directed the high priest to see how many paschal offerings were brought. And he took one kidney from each of the sacrifices, and they found that there were twice 600,000 of them. twice the number who left Egypt, that formulaic number. In other words, if you wanted a sense of how many Jews were there, or how many Jews there were, this was the moment that was determinative. And there was, of course, also the fall pilgrimage, Sukkot, at which time the end of the agricultural work of the year made it possible for large numbers to gather in the central place. If we insist on using the term high holiday, something that I actually banished in my congregation, I don't recommend it, it's not being even translatable into Hebrew, we would have to conclude that Sukkot was the high holiday. And Yom Kippur, which is aptly called by Milgram the day of purgation, purging, that was a day in which people fasted in private support of the high priest, who was preparing and cleansing the sanctuary. And there were people there, but largely other priests and what were called Yakirei Yerushalayim, the big shots of Jerusalem. And it was being purged to be worthy of the worship and service that was to take place 5 days hence, when all the people would be there. So what happened? History has somehow conspired to make Pesach into the private home holiday. And the days of awe, the preferred term, are the days on which such large numbers come together that one feels the urge to say that obscure bracha, Baruch Chacham Harazim. Indeed, even in terms of renewing membership, if you think about it, that was once Pesach. Now, when do the dues bills go out from the synagogue? Announcing Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, get your seats, pay your dues, that's when you renew your membership. Such has been the reversal. So it's not necessarily good or bad, I'm just noting it. It's one of the things that we live with, and probably everyone experiences that. There's a need to be with others. It's palpable. You can sense it as people see one another again. Many haven't seen each other since the last Yom Kippur. And they're reassured when they see the right people there near them that all is well. They may notice and mourn the absence of those few here and there who are no longer present. You even see it in the ways in which people express their seating preferences for the holiday. Something gets reconfigured, oh, but I gotta be near the right people, the people that I'm used to sitting next to. Sometimes they don't even know their names. Because whom they are surrounded by is somehow significantly important to them. Now, the communal complexion of the days of awe is augmented by the collective plural used in the liturgy. We've heard that over and over again in different forms today, and especially in the confession. This is usually cited with a certain amount of approval, and there are two reasons for that. So one is that we generally applaud the idea that each individual is taking responsibility for and to the community. Kol Yisrael arevim zeh lezeh. It's similar to asking for communal needs and not merely individual needs in the weekday Amidah. For us today, I think, it is a reminder that our individual failings are hardly the whole picture. And it forces us to consider the ways in which we are unwittingly and or complacently complicit in larger systemic injustices. Someone just mentioned at the very end of last session I was in, Heschel's famous line, in a free society, few are guilty, but all are responsible. And that's captured by the plural use in the confession. There's a second reason to approve of the communal cast in the confession. It was articulated perhaps most strongly by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. And I want to summarize it both to appreciate it and also to raise some potential problems with it. So he wondered about the upbeat major key melody he heard in a German synagogue for Hashamnu. So Yisrael Lifshitz, Tiferet Yisrael, the 19th century, Danzig had already remarked on this in his commentary on the last Mishnah in Tractate Ta'anit. Here's what Lifshitz said. He said, sincere confession turns sins into inadvertencies, which are then pardoned, And so even though you might think that Ashamnu would require a mournful mode of recitation, confession is actually an occasion for a victory celebration. Incidentally, the melody that Ashkenazim use is essentially that of what is used for Shirat Hayam. I like to call that melody, now here's with apologies to Jackie Gleason for those who are old enough like me to remember this, it's called traveling music, right? It's a triumphant marking of a successful transition, whether it's a transition through the sea, or for one place of the wanderings in the wilderness to the next, which we do in Parshat Mas'eh, ever closer to the promised land at each step, or from one book of the Torah to the next, Chazak, Chazak, V'nit Chazek, or moving from one day of creation to the next on Simchat Torah, Vayer Vayivoker Yom Sheni, or most surprisingly, Ashamnu. Think of it. Shira Ladonai Ki Gao Ga. Then there's a little Ashamnu. Now here's what Soloveitchik added to this as recorded in Al HaTeshuvah. He said there's a difference between the individual confession and the communal one. The individual, as an individual, is not assured of forgiveness unless and until the heart is broken and true inner repentance is achieved. But as a member of the Jewish people, the very act of communal confession, which means of being willing to identify with the Jewish people as a whole, its triumphs, its failings, its fate, that assures one of complete reconciliation with God as a member of the Jewish people. Because, as the prelude to the communal confession puts it, we always say this before the communal confession is, before you do Ashamnu, you do Ki anu amecha v'ata Eloheinu. We are your people, you are our God, eternally, come what may. And all one has to do is to identify with that people of the eternal covenant, and you are assured of being part of Israel's solidarity with its God. And hence, the major key, triumphant traveling music. So this is spiritually exciting, it's spiritually uplifting, it's worth holding on to. I don't gainsay it at all. And yet, all this is not entirely unproblematic. And I want to raise two issues with it for the purpose of consideration, reaction, perhaps a little discussion as time permits. So, first problem. For all of its healthy prompting of communal responsibility, there's a danger lurking in the plural confession. We have sinned. So let me make the problem vivid in an amusing kind of way. Did you know that together, Derek Jeter and I have 3,465 major league hits? The statement is unassailably true. But you see, all the hits are actually his. Right? Now, in the same way that hiding behind the plural can allow us to claim credit for things that we had no part in, it can also allow us to evade responsibility for those things we actually do have a part in. It's just the other side of the coin. We've sinned, we are guilty, allows us to say, yeah, it's the other guy. One thing practitioners learn is that the nice compliment, good sermon, Rabbi, all too often means the following, properly translated. It means, I, of course, already agreed with you, but it was so important for that benighted person in the next row to have heard that. Denial? That's the other guy's problem. So that's problem number one. Second, and more important to me, we should be careful not to avoid thinking about this problem. So Soloveitchik's beautiful and inspiring idea that we are part of an eternal covenant because of which we can expect and even demand reconciliation and renewal with God. This is apparently a form of what is sometimes known in Jewish thought as the Davidic covenant, in Christian thought as well for that matter. The essential, unconditional commitment God made to David, that no matter what he or any of his descendants might do, there might be temporary consequences, but never, ever an abrogation of the pact. Contrast this with the covenant at Sinai, of which we are brutally reminded in this week's parasha, Ki Tavo, and what's called the Tochecha, this admonition, that violating that covenant egregiously and repeatedly would bring with it an end to the relationship, because it ends with, back to Egypt with you, in slave ships that will be unable to find buyers. I love the upbeat nature of Yom Kippur, and I love the major key of the Hashamnu as much as anyone. But I think we should ask ourselves, which is more civilizing? A covenant that sets explicit and honest conditions for its validity and continuation, and thus forces us to confront our failings and their expected consequences? Or a covenant that tells us some form of the following, and here I'm going to quote from Psalm 89. I have found David, my servant, anointed him with my sacred oil. I will maintain my steadfast love for him always. My covenant with him shall endure. If his sons forsake my teaching and do not live by my rules, if they violate my laws and do not observe my commandments. Let me pause here for a second. Readers of Deuteronomy would expect what's coming next, which is back to Egypt with them. But no. I will punish their transgression with the rod, their iniquity with plagues, but I will not take away my steadfast love from him. I will not betray my faithfulness. I have sworn by my holiness once and for all, I will not be false to David. And here's my last point and my real concern. I'm thinking of such things as American exceptionalism and a celebratory dwelling on an exceptionalism of Israel. Soloveitchik's beautiful depiction of the certainty that we can have, that connection with the Jewish people gives us participation in an unconditional relationship with God, that was both inspiring and I would say even necessary when the communal entity of Israel had no real power of action and justice or injustice was done largely to it and not by it. That is no longer the case. And I maintain that there is at least cause for worry in a time of Jewish statehood and Jewish power over others if we do not extend the anxious soul-searching and the anxious confession and the need for repentance, which we apply to the individual, to the people, and to the nation as well. So I hold both Soloveitchik's beautiful teaching in one hand, and I try to hold these concerns in the other hand, and I'm not sure exactly where the balance comes out. But I think these are things that when talking about the individual and the communal, we should not fail to keep on the table of discussion and meditation during these days.
So just to pick up where you left off, while I agree with you that there is a danger of, being complacent, feeling entitled, not looking at what we might be doing wrong, I also wonder, and this was prompted for me by Irit Ofer-Stark's presentation, that was about the question of taking tunes from churches and using them in Jewish services on the days of awe, or taking your shoes off in synagogue the way that the Muslims do, where she read to us from a tshuva, from a responsum that suggested, and I don't like this, but I'm quoting it as someone else, that suggested that, no, we need to take what they do because what they do clearly means kavod and dignity, and therefore we have to have it too, because if we don't have it, then people are going to think that we don't do it right. Sometimes I wonder, when you place yourself as, we're wearing white because as the Talmud Yerushalmi says, other people have to go in wearing dark colors to their din, to their judgment, because they're afraid that they're going to lose. It's a somber moment. But we walk into our judgment wearing white because we know we're going to win. How much does that betray a real feeling of we know we're going to win? And how much does that that betray some anxiety that we're not actually sure what our fate is? And to be able to open that up as something that might actually be the lady doth protest too much, I think is an interesting, I think it's an opportunity, right? I think it's an opportunity to use that tune and then to talk about why is it that we're using that tune and do we have that confidence, in addition to the critique that you leveled. And I'm kind of, what I'm most shocked by is a few people alluded to this today, the transformation, or Will, you used a great term, investment, that the rabbis invested Rosh Hashanah with the status of Yom Hadin, with the status of a day of judgment. It's not something we really find much before the rabbinic establishment. And when they do so, actually it's they themselves who invite God in to do judgment. And what I mean by that is, in order to know whether it was Rosh Hashanah, whether it was the first day of the 7th month, witnesses would have to come into a Beit Din, into a human court, and say, we've seen the new moon. The human court would then say, it's Rosh Hashanah. And as again, the Talmud Yerushalmi in Masechet Rosh Hashanah describes, where else do you have the defendant inviting the judge in? It's as though we're so sure that it's going to work out. But again, is that a way of maybe legitimizing that, we're just going to lean into this because what else is there to do? So that's just one thought on what you were saying. Another thought is, to be honest, this might be just me, but I have a feeling it's not just me. When I was, I think when I was 18, which was longer ago than it looks, I took a ta'anit dibur on Yom Kippur. I decided that I wasn't going to talk to anyone on Yom Kippur. And the reason I decided that was severalfold. One is that I just didn't want to mess up. I didn't want to tell Lashon Hara. I didn't want to, I didn't even want to do Sichat Chulin. Like, I didn't even want to just have a regular conversation. It's Yom Kippur. You only have 25 hours. You have to use every minute. And for anybody who, when they want to have kavanah, when they want to have focus, closes their eyes, you actually know the feeling of actually feeling distracted by being in a crowd and being in a group of people. And I don't think that that is something, I don't think it's so easy. The idea that we're all sitting there actually reviewing and thinking about what it is that we've done in the presence of other people before whom we probably never admit the things that we know in our heads and in our hearts that we've done, let alone something that Nahumi was talking about when she discussed social norms. I think, and again, this might just be me, I think it is much easier to focus and to speak in a sober religious manner in a smaller group of people than in a larger group of people. Not in this kind of forum where you have two people at the microphone and we've created a whole day that it's supposed to look like this. But there's something about the self-consciousness that people have around being genuinely, religiously vulnerable in front of each other. Oh, the rabbi is going to give the sermon. The rabbi is going to talk the Torah. Oh, do you see my kid is so into the prayers, like that's so interesting. I think there is something that sometimes happens, and you feel it the minute when Yom Kippur is over. Yom Kippur ends, people go to pray Arvit. I did that for my Sephardic liturgist. Arbit, did I do it? Arbit, people go to pray, and then other people just start talking. It's like you just did 25 hours of Yom Kippur, and you're just talking while somebody else is trying to daven? What is that? And I'm not talking to us, I'm talking to me, I'm talking to all of us. There's something uncomfortable about the sobriety of it. There's tension that you can feel. And what I kind of hope for is having a communal Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur experience, and slichot, by the way, right? That would actually help to break that down, and would help to say, you know what? It's okay if you're a group of 6 people and nobody makes a joke to like cut the tension when we're talking about real things. I think that's very hard for modern Western people. I just think it's very hard. And it's one of the reasons we wanted to end the day with conversation to and fro, because it's not easy to sit in a class. I mean, these classes were demanding. They were really interesting and demanding and to focus on it. But to actually have the conversations and lead the conversations with your own people, not in a formalized setting, how do we do it? And I wonder if Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur can actually change the social norms or help us change the social norms around it. Or going back to Will's shiur from this morning, is the fact that it's within this compressed 10 days actually ruin it. Because it's like, okay, we'll do all our seriousness here, and then we're not really gonna talk about it. And for anybody who's ever like been shushed, or like you're talking to a friend about something, you're like, you know what, I don't really want to engage in that conversation about that other person. That's very uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to say, it's uncomfortable to hear. So how do you do it? So that's a second sort of problematic that I want to bring in. A third problematic that I want to bring in. So let's say we decide that, you know what, we are going to reckon with ourselves as a community. Like, we're going to do it. So 2 questions about that. Do we even agree on what's good and bad anymore as a community? We have such different understandings within the self-same community. I'm not talking about is stealing good or bad objectively. I'm talking about particular ways in which ethics get negotiated. We could have deep disagreements, and not because I'm bad and you're good, but actually because we have deep disagreements. And so one of the things that I wonder is, we're saying Ashamnu, we're guilty, and I'm sort of like, yeah, we're guilty about X, Y, and Z, you know? And you're saying we're guilty about not X, Y, and Z, literally. Is it kind of a blessing that we don't say what it is? Or actually, should there be an opportunity, and this is actually quite dangerous, should there be an opportunity for an airing, an actual conversation around the things we disagree over as communities, not to come to some, this is the policy and this is what we're going to do, but to do cheshbon hanefesh, to think about how we do things. Would it be possible? And to be honest, right now when everything moral is overshadowed by a political lens, you have to do a lot of work to make sure that people realize that what you're not trying to do is just have a conversation about political partisanship. But is there a way to do it, especially when people feel implicated even by knowing what the other person in their community thinks? You know, there's a sociologist, I think, Adam Seligman. He talks about the difference between the ritual self and the sincere self. And he says the sincere self is what I really think, right? Like some people in this room, the sincere self is, oh my goodness, I'm so hungry, I need to go eat something. Some people, the sincere self is, this is really gonna help me thinking about these 10 days. Some people are still trying to think if your numbers of the home runs were correct or not, and they're looking it up on their phones. That's the sincere self. Likely, there's a lot of different sincerities going on in this room right now. But the way we present at the moment is the ritual self, is the performance. We're all performing, más o menos, we're all performing as though we are engaged in this conversation. Now, what would happen if we took a step back for a second and said, could we have everybody just tell us exactly what they're feeling at this moment? It would destroy the imagined moment that we've created. It might make people feel more seen. But I actually think that in a way, the Yamim Noraim, the days of off season, is one big ritual self. I'm showing up on a day that I didn't choose with people who I might not know their names. I mean, I have some sense like they're here, they're doing the performance, I'm here, I'm doing the performance, something, right? I'm saying words that I didn't make up. I struggle every year. Does this resonate with anybody? I struggle every year when I'm reciting the vidui to try to think about things that I actually did that relate to that, right? That relate to anybody? Or how about this? over the course of my 2 days in shul on Rosh Hashanah or my 1 day in shul on Yom Kippur, I try to think of different family members of mine. Because I can't think of them all at once and different friends and what I'm praying for. There's no place for it. There's no, except Yizkor, right? I'm talking about my live friends and family who I care about. There's very little place except, and this was Sarah Labaton's class today, except for in Sephardic liturgy and Sephardic vidui, there's very little place to actually say what you've actually done to make the implicit explicit in a real way. It's so much ritual self. And so when I think about this fact that it's so much ritual self, on the one hand, it's like, oh, that really gives me a sense of confidence because you come, you do the thing, you go home, right? And you're promised. But on the other hand, what it also does is it says, you know what? You don't need any self-consciousness around here. We've given you the text. We've given you the movements. You don't need to actually talk about it. Now, it's one thing to say that on the individual level, but I think it's a whole other problem on a communal level, right? How can we actually use this to talk? And the last thing I want to say, and then I just want to open it up, is that this past week's Parsha, I always promise myself when I do crazy things that I'm not going to share it with everybody, but I'm sharing it with everybody. I came in from Israel this morning at 4:20, okay? I was in Israel for 55 hours. I couldn't sleep Friday night, for great reason, thank God, for great reason. I couldn't sleep Friday night. So I took out a Chumash. I'm sitting, it's literally, I'm in Baka, in Jerusalem. True story, if things I say make no sense, that's one of the reasons. It's midnight, and I'm reading through the Parsha, and I notice that like even the way we frame what it is that our communities do, or how we prosecute or reward what our communities do, or what individuals in our communities do, I noticed 3 different kind of approaches that made me really think about this question of, are we considering what our communities do and what roles we individually play in those communities, right? Because there's the sincere self that's just about me, and there's also the sincere self that's about me in the community. And I saw 3 things. One is I saw over and over again in Parsha Ki Tetzeh, this past week's Parsha, Uvi'arta hara mikirbecha, that you have to get rid of, cleanse the evil from among you. But the description of what it meant to cleanse the evil from among you was that you're going to find the bad actor, and you're going to prosecute the bad actor, right? And generally, it's going to be with capital punishment, right? Now, of course, you need systems and structures in order to do that. You can't just, get that done willy-nilly. You need a court, you need some sort of conventions, you need some sort of agreement writ large about what the values and red lines of the community are. But at the same time, it sort of makes it seem like if we get rid of that guy or that gal, we're good, right? So when I say Hashamnu, as long as I can find Madoff and put him in jail, I did it, right? Never mind the fact that that's supposed to be like a sign that I should be making sure that we don't have more Madoffs, or we don't have them, but that's not the way it's framed, right? Then you have a different kind of framing, which is not get rid of it after the fact. You have something like, and this is, Ki Tetzeh has so many mitzvot. You have something, a pasuk that starts, Lo tiyeh kedesha bivnot Yisrael, that there shouldn't be any woman who is set for harlotry, basically, who's set aside for sex, for prostitution among us. Well, that's an interesting one, because whose responsibility is that? Just says, this shouldn't be. Whose responsibility is it? My responsibility, court's responsibility, police responsibility, parents' responsibility, educators' responsibility, rabbi? Well, I love it, it doesn't say. Everybody's responsibility, right? And even to, or no, but this goes exactly back to what Gordon said, or maybe no one's responsibility, but clearly that's not what the pasuk is trying to tell you, right? It's trying to tell you it's everyone's responsibility, right? And then the third, which is, forget all these don'ts, how about a do, right? And the conversation that's happening regarding people who are encamped because they're going to war, and they have to make sure they have a toilet, essentially, like an ancient toilet, where they can cover up their excrement. Why? Because Vayamachanecha Kadosh, because your camp should be sanctified. V'lo yireh b'cha ervat davar. God should not see anything that literally is like a show of exposure. Nothing bad should be exposed before God, which is a totally affirmative. Now, whose responsibility is that? Right? Whose responsibility is that to make that happen? So, kind of a little bit piling onto your point, I also think that the fact that we are individuals in this conversation, it pushes us further and further away from the ability to actually talk about the things that we ourselves have done and that we need to work in order to get there. And B, it allows us to say, well, there are big problems, not with that person, but with this whole system. But no, what can I do, right? What can I do? So I think it's worth thinking about, and I'd be remiss, I'm sorry about this, I'd be remiss if I didn't say one last thing, which is we have in our midst at Hartman 2 staff members who just recently lost their fathers. And I have to say that in thinking about this individual and community, what I've realized is that when you come into that community and there's somebody who's lost someone, that to me is where you actually see why we're doing this in community. Because there's something about being there for each other that is, I don't know, I'm not the one in mourning, but there's something about being in community that basically says this is a safe holding place for you, right? But that's very far afield from the question of tshuva, right? So I think or maybe not, or maybe not. So I think with some of those ideas, maybe you'll say a thing and then we'll open it up.
Three very, very, very quick things. One is that if all we bring is our sincere selves, we would never have a sidur, a machzor. I mean, all of these things
Right.
are compromises. One of the problems we have in our culture today is that there's a little too much drive towards individuation and customization, and the art of compromise, of the fact that I am willing to say prayers or at least look at prayers on the sheet that I don't really believe in theologically, is a concession to the importance of community. That's number one. Number two, it is true that we're not going to easily agree on what's good or bad for the community. And that's certainly not going to get hashed out on Yom Kippur. But what I was strongly suggesting is that to have the ideology that this is something that will work out or not work out among ourselves, but it doesn't really matter to God, because God's going to be protecting the Jewish people no matter what, is something we may have to think seriously about getting off of the table, and that find times to really hash out not only what we think about things, but what we think God may think about what we as a Jewish people are doing. And the very last thing is the throngs that come to the synagogue, which is so thrilling and so important for congregations, for rabbis, etc. It does fly in the face of one of the beautiful lines that is in the Yom Kippur description in the Torah, when the high priest goes in to the Holy of Holies. It says, "V'chol adam lo yiyeh ba'ohel moed." No one else is allowed to be there. And I always took this as emblematic of what each of us, in some sense, a kingdom of priests, a high priest, each of us should be able to find that place where we are alone, which you did with your Ta'anit Dibur, that Yom Kippur.
The worst Yom Kippur of my life.
Yeah,
The worst.
but
But I need to find that place. But that wasn't it.
I keep thinking of one of my favorite lines in Thoreau, who said, a man who keeps running to the post office hasn't heard from himself in a long time. And the importance of being with all those people on Yom Kippur is great, but you got to hear from yourself. You got to be in that place where there's no other person as well. So these are all the things that I think we have to balance.
All right, we're opening it to you. Comments, thoughts, questions, ideas. Someone's got to cross the Rubicon first here. I think it's like this. Is that good?
We want bad Yom Kippur stories.
Here.
I think I could speak loudly enough.
Can you hear it in the back?
Rabbi Gordon, thank you. That last sentence was profound. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Wasn't mine. Thank you.
I think that for me, the liturgy on the high holidays makes it very, very difficult to accomplish the purpose of the high holidays. Particularly if you look at the confessional and various versions of it throughout. We have, what, 7 repetitions of it throughout the day, something like that? 5, is it?
9.
Oh,
Even
9,
more,
10,
even-
whatever.
Ashkenazic anyway.
I guess that's when I went to take a break. Well,
And 1 week.
there are a lot of them. To say a lot of them that many times in the course of the day makes it impossible, and especially since there's other stuff going on also, makes it impossible to really contemplate what each one is saying. Really think about what each one is saying. Really think about what the community's role in any one of these issues may be, and what my personal role in any one of these issues may be, and how I can affect the community's role in any one of these things. It's really, I find it so frustrating every single year when I go with the mindset of wanting to be contemplative, to have the liturgy make it impossible to be contemplative.
Yeah.
You want to speak first to that?
Well, I mean, it's well known that we Jews don't do so well with silence, which you would need. Sarah Labaton had this great phrase that where was it? Contained exhaustiveness, right? So you're experiencing some of the exhaustiveness. Maybe you should be a little grateful that it's at least just contained in one day, right? Look, there are ways of using it, I think. That is, if we're going to take this as a prompt, many people think of, properly, I think of the Haggadah as it's come down to us, as the received text of the Haggadah, as a prompt.
Right.
These are the sorts of things that people talked about once. Use it as a prompt to do your thing, to think of Al-Chet that way, and then being able to say it in every service gives you the gift of being able to focus on different things in your life as an individual, as a member of community. It doesn't have to be the same in Shacharit or in Musaf or in Mincha, right? So it gives you different prompts during the day. But I recognize the problem. The liturgy is voracious. It just eats everything up on that day.
Right.
I'm also wondering, I also happen to have this practice of trying to focus on different parts of the repetitions each time so that I can really stay focused on that and think about that. And I find it helpful, actually, not to be pressured to stay focused even as I say all of it, but to really know that this is where I'm going to put my contemplation. But the other thing I kind of wonder is whether some work with the Machzor before the Days of Awe season starts, whether that can help. Meaning, I know that sometimes when I sit with my sitter, I sit with my Siddur, and before I ever have to say anything, I just look at it and say, what does this mean to me? What does it conjure up to me?
Right.
And sometimes I even write it in the margins, so that when I'm then in that tefillah, I'm like, oh, yeah, that does help me, right? I wonder if all of our liturgy, if liturgy in that moment has to do everything for us, or if we need to do some pre-work and some post-work, right? We're talking about this question of how do communities reflect on what they do and what they are, right? That's not going to be just during tefillah. We hope that's not just going to be during tefillah. But I think you're bringing up an important point of what is the work that has to be done in order to make this meaningful, right? I think that's
Tractate Yoma
profound.
begins with the high priest taking 7 days to prepare.
Right. I know.
Even 7 minutes would be more than most of us get to do in terms of really reading the Machzor beforehand. Really.
Yeah, one of the big images for the high holidays, at least for me, is the Book of Life, and who's inscribed in the Book of Life, and who's not, and who's going to perish by flood, and so forth, and disease. And it really, to me, that really reinforces the individual piece. Oh my God, my life is at stake, or and I'm just wondering, have we done too much with that image? If we're looking to go more to the communal, because to me, that whole story really emphasizes the individual fate.
It might be good to take a.
Okay, let's
Yeah,
take a couple.
yeah,
We'll
yeah.
take a couple and then we'll make sure to include.
Yeah.
I think Wendy was next, and then in the back, David, and then Joe.
I find I struggle so with the language of the Machzor. I've been going through it for a lot of years, but my Hebrew is slow, my vision is now slower, that I get tangled in words and I'm not thinking about what I felt I wanted to think about when I got to sit quietly in synagogue, not going anywhere. And I get the feeling that the Machzor is just so full of words that we need some time where we're not struggling to get through all those words. We're just sitting silently and thinking about the words we might have read 10 minutes ago. And yet I'm afraid to do that. I'm going to get lost. And I have to use a different Machzor than the synagogue uses because I need the special one with big print. So I can't even ask the lady next to me, what's the page?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And it's too easy to get lost. And I'm swimming.
Yeah. Okay.
And
We'll
I'd like
come
to
back.
be able to think more.
Yeah. David and then Joe.
From a totally different angle, I almost feel like what we really lose on Yom Kippur with all of this focus on confession, who will live, who will die, is Yom Kippur is supposed to be a happy day in terms of, in the Mishnah Lo Hayu Yomim Tovim Yisrael, Yom Kippur is the happiest of days, this sense at the end of the Seder Havodah, the recounting of the sacrifice when the Kohen exits, and I'm wondering what you think in terms of that tension of it's a day of judgment, but there's this real sense if you read, say like Marei Kohen, that it's really happy, and that we almost lose a lot of that in synagogue life.
Yeah. It's interesting.
I have found in the last few years that the best way that I can experience Yom Kippur is to not sit in synagogue during the afternoon service. And Neil and I have created a ritual for ourselves after Rebbe Nachman's teaching, that in the afternoon we go out into nature and we walk and we get in touch with what is around us, and sometimes we talk and sometimes we don't talk, and then we return for Ne'ilah. And one of the things that I think is so oppressive about Yom Kippur, especially after the morning service, is that there's no movement. We sit and we listen to words and words and words. There's too much words. And I would suggest there's something to be said for either meditation or walking, or what. I had a wonderful congregation, very different kind of congregation down south one year, where we brought in someone to do spiritual dance in the afternoon. We did meditation on Yom Kippur themes, guided meditation, and then this dance, and then we did the Ne'ilah service, and it was marvelous. So, we tend to think about we have to do all these things, but the liturgy is 2,500 years of compiled liturgy. Maybe it's a little too much,
Certainly in 7 repetitions of it.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, so let me just say a couple of things. Yeah, there's a lot of words and way too many. One of the problems with liturgy is it only grows, it never shrinks. Everyone's got their, beautiful piyut, not denying any of that, but you gotta get it in there and,
Unless there's something offensive to the government in it. Then it
yes,
gets censored.
that'll
If you were to
that'll
add
do it.
just a line in
That'll do
places
it.
where you
That'll
want.
do it every time, right. So that is true. And I think we just, first of all, have to recognize that. I'll tell you, in line with what you said about going out during Mincha, I'll tell you one of what's going to sound like a bizarre custom that I had for many years. Before I became permanently a congregational rabbi, I would do as many people who are teachers. I was at JTS. I do these gigs for the high holidays, when I still called them the high holidays. And it happened that I was in different places, whether it was Madison, Wisconsin, or Washington, D.C., or even here in Manhattan. I was always near a zoo. And I would go out at like 7 in the morning on Yom Kippur before Tefillot, and I would just sort of walk through the zoo and just observe the animals and feeling a sense of kind of continuity with nature, confronting a certain kind of vulnerability and mortality that I shared with them. There was something about it that was extremely powerful. So I get exactly what you're saying, and that's where the sincere self, I think, can come in. I mentioned something about the ritual self making community possible, but it shouldn't be a religion. I'm not coming back to shul on Yom Kippur because I developed a cancer this year, and I came on Rosh Hashanah, and the Machzor told me that it was my fault because I hadn't done enough teshuvah or tefillah or tzedakah, and that's why the evil decree was not averted. So I'm not coming back on Yom Kippur. He had to deal with that pastorally, obviously. But this is one of the dangers that we have with a communal liturgy. You talk about the words. What are you more likely to be moved by? What are you more likely to feel is authentic? Your own thoughts, or the thoughts of someone from 1,000 years ago who wrote some beautiful poetry? It's going to be your own thoughts. They have to enter into it. If they don't, then another thing Heschel is reputed to have said is, if you're the same person after you davened as you were before you davened, what was the point of davening, right? What's the point of Yom Kippur if your thoughts and your real emotions haven't come into it, the sincere self?
So it's interesting, just two thoughts that I have as you're talking. One is that I think actually even if you have no intention whatsoever, Yom Kippur is still a container, meaning like that to me is the idea of commandedness, right? Meaning you're not always going to feel it, you're not always going to experience it, but not to make too much of a parallel with the zoo point, but my children on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah actually give me that. Meaning I make it a point, even if I have a babysitter or there are groups or whatever it is, actually make it a point to sit with them, not just with them in shul, but just to sit with them, to just recognize how fragile it all is and how playful, David, to your point, it all is at the same time. And that's why I actually think that Rosh Hashanah meals are so weird. You're really, it's what's hanging in the balance, and you're eating lunch and making jokes, because that's what happens, right, when you're sitting around. But there is something to, hey, make sure that it's connected. But the other thing is, I think that your point about, if it doesn't speak to you or it has to speak to you, also, or the worry about the Schulweis example, where somebody said, I read it in the Machzor, and the Machzor told me that it's my fault. I think that also speaks to the question of what are we doing outside of the readings of the Siddur. When do we bring up a conversation about theology? On Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? About suffering? About why good things, bad things, good people, good things, bad people, right? Meaning, it speaks of that. We can't expect the sitter to do everything. And if we use it well, we not only use it to worship, we not only use it to contemplate, but we also use it as a springboard for certain conversations. And also to David's point about the question of happiness, I actually try to think about inspiration or nourishment. That Yom Kippur ends up being a day, I understand that there's precedent for talking about happiness, but we also know that we don't say Hallel on Yom Kippur because we don't have too much simcha on Yom Kippur. We don't have too much happiness on Yom Kippur. I think of it much more as a contentment, right? Like you walk out of Yom Kippur, and by the way, that's why some of the boisterous talking starts when Ma'ariv starts, because people are like, we did it, like we're starting again, like this is great, it's a clean slate. There's actually something great about that. Right, like people are excited. I think there's something that's deeply nourishing. And to be honest, like that question of mi yachya u'mi yamut, it's not just about individuals, right? It's about medinot, right? It's about countries and regions and the world. But I also think that it's not such a bad thing, not for somebody who is struggling with cancer.
Right.
It's not such a bad thing for me to stand there and say, oh wow, like in such a fundamental way, I don't know what this year brings. I think that's a very humbling experience, notwithstanding that people could be in all sorts of contexts that make that too difficult for them, or too jarring for them, or too theologically problematic for them, right? I don't know. I think we could take a couple more.
Just a Rosh Hashanah remembrance for me. It's not Yom Kippur, it's Rosh Hashanah, and you'll see why. My father, of blessed memory, died on Tisha B'Av, actually. And this was 19 years ago. And I had this kind of jolt on the first night of Rosh Hashanah when Kiddush came in the synagogue, because it was the first time that I had heard and had said Birkat She'echianu since he died. And it was jolting to me, because here is about life, and I had just experienced this death, and then it became very precious, that moment, because, you know, everyone who says mi yachya u'mi yamut, by definition, is alive, and the vast majority of them are healthy. So just being able to be back at that prayer with other people, as for all of the things that it can evoke, the fact that you're there, the fact that you're able to struggle with it, and you're here to do it, and you're healthy enough to do it, is itself, you know, can evoke some sense of gratitude.
I think we're gonna have to close. I think our final word, tell me if you're comfortable with this final word. The final word would be, we hope that this kicks off for you, or is continuous with, contemplation and planning for the days of awe. That when you come to the Siddur, and you come to the worship, and you come to the awe, and you come to the, you know, trying to find the sincere self in it, that actually what you learned today from all of our scholars here, and from each other, is something that you take with you into that. And that this be a year of learning and growth and sweetness and health and happiness and productivity for all of us in the concentric circles of which we are a part. Thank you so much.
Thank you.